Okay.
Good morning. And may I be the first to say Happy National First Ladies Day to all of you. Yes. Now, this is about the second or third time we've had to go through this since we started First Ladies Day. When someone says Merry Christmas to you, what do you say back to them? Merry Christmas, right? So Happy National First Ladies Day to you.
Happy National First Ladies Day.
Well, thank you. I'm so excited about this program today. If you are rooted in Marshfield at all, you know that we had a very special visit in 1991 from then President George H.W. Bush and his wife Barbara. And as a fourth grader in the parade that day, I remember thinking, wow, this is happening in our town. It was a day that history really came to life for me, and I've always said that's the day I think I really fell in love with the history of the presidency. And I'm so excited to hear Jean interviewed today from so many stories of working with George and Barbara Bush. And we were just visiting, I think we met in 2008 in College Station at the George H.W. Bush Library when we went on behalf of the Cherry Blossom Festival to present President and Mrs. Bush with the Hubble Medal of Initiative. So today to hear all the great stories that she has captured in now 2 books, correct? Our great moderator, Massee McKinley, her good friend. Put your hands together for this great duo.
Jean, it's such a pleasure to have you at the festival, and we're so thrilled that you're here. And I wanted to first off tell a little bit about Jean. Jean served as the Chief of Staff for President H.W. Bush for nearly 25 years. She's the editor of Pearls of Wisdom by Barbara Bush and author of the New York Times bestseller, The Man I Knew, The Amazing Story of George H.W. Bush, Post-Presidency. And her latest book is one that we'll talk a lot about today, and it is Character Matters and Other Life Lessons from George H.W. Bush. And it was released in April of 2024. Prior to her post as Chief of Staff, Jean served as Deputy Press Secretary to First Lady Barbara Bush and was a newspaper reporter for 10 years, including a 4-year stint at USA Today. So I'm so excited that you're here because I know that George H.W. Bush was such a champion of women, and I wanted to kind of get an idea about what it was like to work for him and for Barbara.
I had the best boss in America and had the best job in America. I loved Barbara Bush. I will tell you that it is very hard to hurt my feelings. I have a spine like this because Barbara Bush always told you exactly what she thought. And I adored her. She was a woman ahead of her time. But she would call me at 6 o'clock in the morning and say, have you lost your cotton picking mind? And I'd be like, good morning. What are you thinking of today? But because it's National First Ladies Day, I'm going to tell you a quick story about President Bush. And this is a story I'll just tell the story. So we're in the office, and one of Mrs. Bush's staffers, her personal aides, actually helping answer the phones. And the phone line rings, and it's General Colin Powell asking to talk to President Bush. And before Kara could transfer him in, the second phone line rings, and it's Secretary James A. Baker III, President Bush's Secretary of State under him. Then the third line rings. It's the governor of Texas. Oh, his name was George W. Bush. And Kara's looking at 3 blinking phone lines thinking, oh my God, and she's ready to run into President Bush's office to say you have these 3 calls, when of course our fourth and final line rings, Barbara Bush. So she puts Mrs. Bush on hold, she runs into President Bush's office, she said, sir, Colin Powell, James Baker, the governor, and your wife are all on hold. Those 4 blinking lines, that's who they are. And without hesitating, he said, put my wife through and tell the others I'll call them back.
That's great.
He understood the importance of National First Ladies Day. He was a smart man to take his wife first and tell the others later. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's great. So, Jean, I wanted to ask you, how did you first meet President Bush, and what convinced you, you know, to go and work for him?
Okay, can I do something really obnoxious?
Sure,
Can I tell my story?
sure. Tell
I'll
it.
answer that question.
Tell it.
But I woke up this morning thinking of a story I wanted to share with you all today because it's about the funeral of a pope. And this seems like an appropriate day to share it. So when Pope John Paul II died, the President of the United States was George W. Bush, and he invited all the former presidents to go with him to the Pope's funeral. And his dad went, and President Clinton went. President Ford was not in good enough health, and President Carter had an obligation he could not get out of. So 3 presidents head to Rome, and they land in Rome about midnight. And the presidential motorcade goes straight to the Vatican, to St. Peter's, to pay their respects. The Pope was lying in state. The President Bush and President Clinton rode with the president. So they go to the Vatican. I'm back in Houston watching this on TV, and I must say I started crying when I saw the 3 of them walk in. It was so powerful. So they leave St. Peter's. By this time, it's almost 1 o'clock in the morning, and the President of the United States is staying at the ambassador's residence, and President Bush and President Clinton are staying in a hotel. And the president wants to give them a ride to their hotel. And President Bush says to his son, no. You go to bed. You have meetings in the morning. You need to get some sleep. We have our own cars here. And the personal aide who was traveling with President Bush said that the President of the United States looked at his dad. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. And he said, Dad, just get in the car. And President Clinton agrees with, they're like, no, George, you know, and Tommy, who told me the story, said the president was so frustrated. He was being a son, not a president. He did not want to leave his father and a former president in the middle of St. Peter's Square at 1 o'clock in the morning. But they wouldn't get in the car. So finally, the presidential motorcade leaves, and there's not one car left in St. Peter's Square at 1 a.m. It's the 2 presidents and nobody. Well, they're Secret Service agents, and Tommy said the agents went crazy, thinking, are we going to have to call a cab? You know, what the hell? So they're on the radios, they're running around, and another delegation pulls up to pay their respects. And again, I'm being told this story. Tommy said that the other delegation gets out of the car, and there's George Bush and Bill Clinton. And they're like, hello. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. And they're like, can we have photos? And the 2 presidents like, sure, come on over. And one of the Secret Service agents goes up to President Bush's aide and said, they're Iranians. We don't even have diplomatic relations with them. And so Tommy tried to tell President Bush, he said, they're good people, get away from me, and take him pictures. So to make a long story short, they found the cars were outside, they were out on the street. The presidential motorcade was so big, they couldn't get the former president's 3 cars. So they finally, at 1 o'clock in the morning, they got in their car and went to the hotel. But I just thought I wanted to share that funny little story. And my favorite part of the story is the President of the United States saying, Dad, please get in the car. And his father saying, no. Okay. That did not answer your question. What was your question?
So how did you first meet President Bush?
Okay. I met him as a reporter. I was covered the 1988 election for USA Today. I was on the election team. And as part of my assignment, Barbara Bush and Kitty Dukakis, who was the wife of the Democratic candidate, Governor Dukakis, they agreed to write a weekly column for USA Today in September and October of 1988. It was called On the Campaign Trail. And I was their editor. And they would turn their columns into me every Sunday evening, and I usually would have to cut them. They wrote too much, and I got to know both of those women very, very well. I would travel with them once a week to see what they were planning on writing about. Anyway, fast forward to after the election, and I invited Barbara Bush's chief of staff to lunch to pitch some ideas for inauguration week. USA Today was wanting to use my relationship with the First Lady, the incoming First Lady, to maybe get some behind-the-scenes coverage. And we're having lunch, and she is unloading to me. She'd just gotten chewed out by President Bush's press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, because Susan had hired a campaign deputy and someone from the Hill to be in the First Lady's press office, to be her press secretary, a woman from the Hill, and to be one of the two deputies, a woman from the campaign. And Marlin said to her chief of staff, "You have got to hire a journalist in the First Lady's press office. The other deputy has to be someone with reporting experience." And her exact line was, he said to her, "You have to have someone who knows how those people think." And Susan is sitting there looking at me saying, "I don't even know any reporters. I don't know who to hire. I don't know anybody." And I can still remember when she looked at me across the table and said, "Oh my God." And she offered me the job on the spot. Wow. And I didn't say yes. It was going to be a huge pay cut. I really loved my job at USA Today. I went home for Thanksgiving. My dad was a farmer in mid-Missouri. Never graduated from high school, but one of the smartest people I knew. And I told him about the job offer. And he looked at me and he said, "Let me get this straight. You've been offered a job to work in the White House for the First Lady of the United States, and you're thinking about it?" And he literally said, "What the hell's wrong with you?" So I went to the phone and I took the job.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow,
So
that's amazing.
thank you.
So to follow up with that, Jean, you worked in the
For
White
her.
House, and then what happened post-presidency?
When he lost the election, Mrs. Bush asked me to go to Houston with them to help her with her memoirs. She would want me to tell you that she wrote him herself, which she did. I was her editor and her researcher and her fact checker. And we took us about a year, and I was getting ready. I had a job waiting for me at the Chicago Sun-Times. I was going to go back to being a reporter. And President Bush called me into his office. I'd gotten to know him a little bit in that first year post-White House. His first post-White House chief of staff was going to retire. And he said to me, he said, "Barbara thinks that maybe you could help out. I need to hire a chief of staff. I have no ideas. I need to think this through. Could you fill in while I figure this out?" And I said, "No." I said, "Sir, I don't know how to be a chief of staff. I've never been anyone's boss." And I said, "I can't bounce my own checkbook. I can't run your office." And he said, "Well, just keep the seat warm. We'll make it up as we go." And he said, "I'll take you to Kennebunkport with me this summer." Kennebunkport, Maine, a lot nicer than Houston, Texas in the summertime. And I said, "Okay, but by Labor Day, I'm gone." We never talked about it again. I was his chief of staff for 25 years. Actually, I did bring it up to him like 20 years later. And I said, "I'm still waiting for you to come in my office and say, 'Oh, Jean, I've hired a chief of staff. You can go now.'" But, we got busy, and it didn't take me long to realize I had the best job in America.
Wow.
So I didn't remind him he was supposed to replace me.
Wow. Unbelievable. Well, I know that election had to be a really disappointing election for President Bush. So how did you help him focus on what he wanted to accomplish post-presidency?
I think he really didn't need my help. He needed my help to control him and organize him, because there's actually a chapter in this book. This is the book I wrote about the 25 years I was his chief of staff. There's a whole chapter called "I Have an Idea." It was the scariest words the man ever said to me. I still remember the morning he walked in my office and said, "Jean, I have an idea." And I'm like, "Oh my God, okay." And this was his idea. He announced to me that he decided he was going to start jumping out of airplanes. It's like 7 o'clock in the morning, and I said, "What?" He said, I would like to pay. He was shot down during World War II. He was a bomber pilot off of an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific. He was shot down on a bombing run. His 2 crew members did not survive. He was in the water for 3 hours before he was rescued by an American submarine. I think he needed a do-over. He jumped, I think, 8 times post-presidency. I did ask him when he told me he wanted to start parachuting, I said, have you told your wife? And he said, over drinks tonight. So by the time I became his chief of staff, he'd been out of office for a year. And I think he was over it. He went through a really tough time, but he had gotten over it. He had 2 sons running for governor, George W. in Texas and Jeb in Florida, and I think that really helped snap him out of it. And by the time I became his chief of staff, he just hit the ground running. Wow. I will tell you in the chapter about I Have an Idea, I do want to share this picture with you. I'm not very good at this. Hold on. There are some days I have no idea what he was thinking. That is an aardvark hat. I know some of you are going to Google aardvark, aren't you? He wore that one whole day. And I'm trying to have a very serious conversation with him here. And I think he wrote it I wore it just to get on my nerves. And he was successful. It did get on my nerves. But anyway.
So in that book I read, there was a really, really special moment that he made in his diary entry right after the election. And I think I read it, and I think you probably have it. But it's such a touching thing that he wrote.
Oh, I love that you asked that. I already loved you, Massee. Now I really love you. It's marked in my book. This is what he wrote in his diary the night he lost the election to Bill Clinton. And what I love about this diary entry, the Character Matters is a book of essays written by the people who knew him best. Friends, there's a couple of former heads of state, friends, staff, family. I mean, Reba McEntire has an essay in this book. Dana Carvey has an essay in this book. The young man who mowed the yard at Walker's Point in Kennebunkport has an essay in this book. But one whole chapter, it's his voice. I put in some of his speeches, some of his letters, some of his essays. This is a diary entry from the night he lost the election. It's 12:15 in the morning, November 4th. The election is over. It's come and gone. It's hard to describe the emotions of something like this. The job is not finished, and that kills me. Now into bed, prepared to face tomorrow. Be strong, be kind, be generous of spirit, be understanding, and let people know how grateful you are. Don't get even. Comfort the ones I've hurt and let down. Say your prayers and ask for God's understanding and strength. Finish with a smile and some gusto, and do what's right and finish strong.
I mean, that is quintessential George H.W. Bush. Wow.
It really is. It really,
Wow.
really is.
And now, Gene, I've also, in that particular book, I've kind of read between the lines, but George H.W. Bush called a head of state every day.
When he was president.
When he was president. And can you tell me a special time that he might have called a head of state, and there was a funny story or a wonderful story about that?
Let me, first of all, I want to make sure that you all understand that I did not work for him at the White House. I was in the East Wing working for the First Lady. I do know a lot of White House stories that he told me, or that I became very close to his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, who actually told me this story. So I can tell a story, but I just want you to know it is secondhand, if that's okay. So President Bush was under President Nixon, he was ambassador to the United Nations. Under President Ford, he was our envoy to China. So he had some international experience. And when he was at the UN, he was famous for walking around the UN building and calling on all the ambassadors, not just France or Great Britain or, the big ones, but everybody. And he became, something like the American ambassador came and saw us today. Well, General Scowcroft told me when he was president, he called the head of state every single day. And yes, there were days he called Brian Mulroney in Canada, and he called his good friend John Major in Great Britain, or Francois Mitterrand in France. But some days it was just random. And Brent's favorite was he came into work, and the president said to him, some country in Africa had won a big soccer game. And the president of the country's son had scored the winning goal. And President Bush said, I want to call him. I want to call the president. I can't remember what country it is, but let's just say it was Kenya. I'm making that up. Let's call the president of Kenya. And Brent said, you don't know him. Well, it's about time. Let's get him on the phone. So Brent said the funny thing is that they got, the president of Kenya, Brent placed the call, and the president said, the president of the United States is calling me? Do you know why? And General Scowcroft said, oh, you'll find out. And then President Bush got on the phone and said, congratulations, you must be so proud of your boy. And, it was but during his presidency, as you remember, was Desert Storm. When the United States and the coalition kicked Saddam Hussein and Iraq out of Kuwait. There were 70 countries that were part of that coalition. And General Scowcroft said the reason they were able to put that coalition together is because they all knew him, knew 41, knew President Bush, we call him 41, knew President Bush, trusted him, and would walk on water for him. So Brent said when they started calling countries to say, will you join our coalition against Iraq, the answer was, of course. And part of it was because he called somebody every day just to say hello, to say, how are you? What's going on in your country? Congratulations to your son. That's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing. It is.
I wanted to also say something about one of the anecdotes in the book, and it was, made by the former Prime Minister of England. He said, working with George Bush was like taking a master's class in leadership. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Gene, and why he said that? And I can kind of know why, but I want to hear it from you.
Well, you would have to, I'm not trying to sell books. You can buy them afterwards. You would have to read the book. I would love for you to read John Major's explanation of it. But what Prime Minister Major said is that President Bush, I know this just from being his chief of staff, and of course it's a little different outside of the White House. He was so decisive. He would think through, I would go to him with an issue or a problem or a challenge, and I could watch him think it through, and then he'd make a decision like that. I don't think I've ever worked with anyone who was more decisive. And that is what his head of state friends loved. They would call him, he would call them for advice. He would want to hear what they had to think about Iraq, or the Cold War was coming to an end. But then he would make up his mind. Brent Scowcroft, and actually Secretary Becker told me, sitting in the Oval Office, they would go around the room and everybody would tell him what they thought. And he would sit there and listen, ask a couple of questions, and then he would say, give me 10 minutes and come back. And then he would give them his answer. Wow. He really was amazing on how he processed information, I think.
Wow, that's amazing. Gosh. So Gene, you mentioned it earlier, but tell us a little bit about the skydiving experience that when he first started, he had the very first one, and then he jumped again. And tell us a little bit about that. And
he loved it. He loved jumping out of an airplane. He said it was such great freedom, and he was going to jump on his 90th birthday, and he was in a wheelchair. He had Parkinson's disease, but he's going to parachute out of an airplane. and his wife was very upset. He was going to do a tandem jump. Unlike the jump I showed you earlier, the last couple of jumps, he did what's called a tandem jump. But I called his oldest son, the 43rd President of the United States, and I said, I could use some help here. I said, I think your parents are on the edge of divorce. They were married 73 years. And I said, your mom is furious. And I said, your dad is insisting on jumping on his 90th birthday. To which the 43rd president said to me, what are you afraid of? Exactly. And I said, well, Mr. President, I'm afraid he's going to die when he jumps. And he said, and that's exactly how Dad would want to go. He said, if you take this away from him, it will kill him. He says, Jean, he's 90. And he said, do I want him to die? No. And, of course, I wanted to say, you're the one who couldn't make him get in the car at the Vatican. But he said, let him do this. And I said, well, you need to talk to your mother. And I'm like, okay. So he jumped, and he lived to tell about it. But I did tell him that I would not help him on his 95th birthday. I said, if you think I'm going to help set up your parachute jump, and he said, I don't need you. I can set it up on my own. And he said, I used to be head of the CIA. I know people. And I'm like, that has nothing to do with you parachuting out of a plane. He died when he was 94, so we didn't have to have that fight. Wow. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And then Gene, too, Bush was a unifier. I mean, he was a unifier of people. And, you know, so much camaraderie existed among, you know, the people that he was around all the time.
Thank you for asking that question.
And, you know, how did that work? And, you know, he worked with so many people across the aisle, and compromise was a big thing.
Okay, first of all, I want you to ignore the woman in the back of this photo who appears to be photobombing the president. I tried to convince a recent audience in Nashville that I was not one of two women photobombing the president, and then I realized I had on the exact same top. So this picture was actually taken backstage at Texas A&M. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dumped 40 inches of rain on Houston in 48 hours. It was a bit of a disaster. It was awful. And by this time, President Bush and President Clinton had gotten together and had done a lot of disaster fundraising. Katrina, tsunami in South Asia, the Bush-Clinton disaster funds had become rather famous. When Harvey happened, all the presidents wanted to help. The two George Bushes were just going to raise money for Texas, that was home. But all the former presidents wanted to help. And this is them backstage. And I love this picture for so many reasons. The camaraderie among the five of them is amazing. And I don't care what your politics are, we need to get back to this. This is the way it's supposed to be. It doesn't matter what your politics are. We raised $41 million that night. President Bush was very excited it was $41 million. Now, it's also possible we raised that much money because the two George Bushes were going to do this little event. The Gatlin brothers were coming, and we were going to have a tent and a barbecue. President Obama brought Lady Gaga with him. We sold out Rita Arena where the Aggies play basketball and raised $41 million. The Gatlin brothers did get to sing. The other reason why I love this photo is just, you know, the five of them are having so much fun. But President Bush used to get teased about his friendship with President Clinton. And people would sometimes say, how can you be friends with him? Here, we'll go back to this picture in a minute. This is actually the two of them. They're on the beach in Galveston, Texas in this photo. This is after Hurricane Ike just ripped Galveston to pieces. And actually, Secretary Baker's on the other side of President Bush. But people would give President, but they really did. There's a whole chapter in The Man I Knew called The Odd Couple. And President Bush used to tell people, look, I'm old. I've run out of things to say. And I love hanging out with Bill because he does all the talking. So here's 5 former presidents. Who's talking? Bill Clinton. But he must be telling a good story. I will tell you a funny story. When I told the President and Mrs. Bush that all 4 former presidents were coming, President Bush started crying. He was so touched. Mrs. Bush asked me if she had to give them dinner. The answer was, yes, you do. And for the record, she didn't cook it, but she did host it. Can I tell another disaster story?
Please.
This isn't. So we were in the disaster business, and President Bush and President Clinton, and they didn't like the disasters, but they liked being able to help. It really became his number one mission post-presidency, was helping people who had been hit by a hurricane or a tsunami. And so right after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in August of 2005. And what very few people know, unless you live in Louisiana or Texas, there was a hurricane about a week later called Hurricane Rita. And Hurricane Rita pretty well chewed up what was left of the Louisiana coastline west of New Orleans and a little bit of Texas around Beaumont. And Hurricane Rita was getting no attention. The media, celebrities, FEMA, everybody's in New Orleans because New Orleans was a disaster after Katrina. So a man who lived in Cameron, Louisiana, called our office. His name was Richard Slushlag. And I took his call, and he said, our town has been wiped out, and we can't get any help. FEMA was there doing what they could, but they weren't getting any media attention. They weren't getting the volunteer help and the donations they needed. He said, our hospital was leveled. We have no health care. Do you think President Bush would help us raise money to build an emergency room? He says, if we can get health care back in town, the rest of the town will come home and rebuild, but we need an emergency room. Well, President Bush said, of course, and he did some well-placed phone calls, and the week before Christmas, we were going to go to Cameron with $1 million check and to help break ground for the new emergency room. So I'm showing him the schedule, and he said to me, and it sort of hurt my feelings. He said it was boring. This is a boring event. I'm like, what? I said, a former president coming to town with $1 million a week before Christmas. What's boring about that? And he said, you know what, Jean, these people have had a terrible year. We need to do something bigger for them. And then he said those scary words, I have an idea. He says, Jean, Barr and I have fallen in love with this TV show. We watch it every night. We just love it. It's called ER. And he said there's a young actor on it who I think is the star of the show. His name is George Clooney. Why don't we invite George Clooney to go to Cameron, Louisiana with us? He said, ER, you get it? It's perfect. Well, here's what he didn't get. They're watching ER in reruns on TBS. It's not on TV anymore. George Clooney is making all those ocean movies. He's People Magazine's Sexiest Man of the Year. He's the biggest star in Hollywood. I said to President Bush, ER is not even on TV anymore. And he looked at me and said, every night. He's one of the smartest people I knew, but I would challenge anybody to explain reruns to a former president. And I said, you know what, sir? George Clooney is not going to Cameron, Louisiana the week before Christmas. We don't know him. We don't know anyone who knows him. He is not in my Rolodex. His politics are way to the left of yours. He says, well, that doesn't matter. This isn't political. I said, sir, this isn't going to happen. And I confess, I marched out of his office. I was just a little frustrated with this. One of the worst fights I've ever had with him. That would be George Clooney in Cameron, Louisiana, the week before Christmas. He came. I love telling this story. It does show why I did have the best job in America. So this is what happened. President Bush marched into my office. He could Google with the best of them. He had Googled George Clooney. What are the chances that the producer of all the ocean movies, I think, is the only person President Bush knew in Hollywood? It was a big Hollywood producer named Jerry Weintraub. He and his wife owned a summer house in Kennebunkport, which is how President Bush knew him. He called Jerry Weintraub, who said, I don't know, but let me call George. George came. It was unbelievable. Did I go with them? Yes. On the plane coming home, everybody fell asleep but George and me. There is a God. So I asked him, I said, I'm just curious, why did you do this? You don't know him. You don't. Why did you do this? And this, I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, I was so touched that he was trying to help a town that no one had heard of, that had been destroyed by a hurricane that no one had heard of. Remember he said, who's his best friend? Brad Pitt. He said, Brad Pitt's been trying to get me to come to New Orleans for 6 months. And he says, I'm not going to go to New Orleans. Everybody's in New Orleans. No one's in Cameron, Louisiana. Are they not the two cutest people you ever seen? And I shouldn't tell you this is inappropriate. Yeah, go ahead, sure. So my sister's back there, and I know she's thinking, but I'm from Missouri. I feel very close to all of you. So on the plane coming home, I had to use the facility. I come out of the bathroom. It's a little bitty plane with this really narrow galley. And Clooney is standing in the galley. And to get to my seat, I had to squeeze past him. I mean, full body contact. I have never really recovered from that. Is that inappropriate? No. Oh, dear, there's the young man right here. You didn't think that was a bad story, did you? Yeah. Okay.
That's great, Gene.
Yeah. Of course he does it. Okay.
So on that note about Bill Clinton, Gene, do you have a special story that you can tell about the two of them?
Well, I told you the Pope, the Vatican Square story. They became best friends. And Mrs. Bush called them the odd couple.
Kind of like a son, right?
Yeah, but Mrs. Bush is convinced that her husband was the father President Clinton ever had. And they became best friends. And Mrs. Bush died in April of 2018. In fact, the 7th anniversary of her death was Holy Thursday. And President Bush would die the following November. President Clinton came to Kennebunkport that summer to visit him. And they had a wonderful, wonderful visit. Talked, President Clinton mainly talked, but they had a good visit. And I walked him to the car, and he just completely broke down in tears because he knew. And he made me promise him that he would see him one more time. Promise me you will call me so I can come either back here or back to Houston. Promise me. I need to see him again. So I promised. I didn't do it. And I'll tell you why. He died in Houston in November, and they had such a great last visit. I just wanted that to be their last visit. But here's my big mistake. It just so happened 3 days before President Bush died, President Obama was in Houston to give a speech at the James A. Becker Institute at Rice University. And President Obama's chief of staff called me and said he would really like to come see President Bush. Can he come? And I said, probably not. I think we're getting toward the end here. But I asked President Bush, and he said, yes, I would like to see Barack. I'm like, okay. So I invited the Bush's son, Neil, to join us. John Meacham, the historian, was in town. He was going to interview President Obama. I invited John Meacham to join us just to help with the conversation, and I was in the room, and we were having a nice conversation, and then President Obama looked at me and said, Jean, I would like the room. I would like to be alone. I'm going to get emotional. So I kicked everybody else out, and I'm visiting with his President Obama's staff and Neil, and I realize that John Meacham is missing. Well, he's eavesdropping on the two presidents. And I said, Meacham, get out of there. And he said, I'm a historian. This is my job. He said, it's historic what they're saying. And I yelled at him, and then I said, well, what is he saying? And you know, what President Obama wanted to do was to thank him for his service, to thank him for his service in World War II, to thank him for everything he'd done for our country. He just wanted to say goodbye. And the problem is, President Obama talked about it publicly after President Bush died, and I got a call from President Clinton. It killed him that President Obama saw him last. But he got over it. I told him why I didn't call him, but it was sort of cute. It was sort of like junior high boys, quite frankly. He said, you let Barack Obama see him and not me. I'm like, oh my God. It's, this isn't the high school dance. But they loved him. This started with you asking me about him being a unifier. He was absolutely the unofficial head of the Farmer President's Club. They absolutely all adored him, and they would do anything. I'll just tell you one quick story. I know we're going to run out of time. The baseball All-Star game one year, Major League Baseball wanted to highlight the importance of volunteerism in our country, which was right down our alley. President Bush founded the Points of Light Foundation, which is all about volunteerism. And what they wanted in a perfect world was for every president to highlight a volunteer in their hometown, and that was going to be shown on the big screen. I can't remember where the ball game was, the All-Star game was that year, but it was going to be shown on the big screen before the game began. So they came, President Bui, of course, said yes, and all the presidents said yes, and they came to Kennebunkport to tape President Bush's. And the guy from Major League Baseball, who was in charge of it, he pulled me aside, and he said, every single president, including the sitting president, who was then Obama, when we called to make this request, the first question we got they were dealing with mainly the chief of staffs. The first question was, is George H.W. Bush doing it? And when we said yes, they're like, okay, we're in. And that's the kind of influence he had with everything. And you can see, oh no, that's still the Clooney photo. Never mind. But they did. He was a unifier. He brought them all together.
That's amazing.
They followed his lead.
Absolutely. I can see why.
Yeah.
And now, Gene, I talked with you about this, but, you were tasked with a big task to actually, put together a presidential funeral.
I ran the funeral,
And
yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that, because that you kind of created the blueprint for that.
I did not. Thank you. Who taught me how to do a presidential funeral would be the chief of staffs of President Ford and President Reagan. After their presidents died, they both wrote me big memos about what went wrong. And you learn more from what goes wrong, right, than what goes right. Their memos to me became my blueprint how to do a presidential funeral. And President Ford's, the person in charge of his funeral, actually flew to Houston to meet with me. And after President Bush died, I wrote like a 3-page memo and sent it to all my fellow chief of staffs. And 3 of them flew to Houston to meet with me for a day because, again, it's complicated. I will tell you one funny story. One of the big problems that both President Ford and President Reagan chief of staffs had with their funerals at the National Cathedral. I actually have a picture. That's President Bush's state funeral at the National Cathedral in December 2018. President Ford died the day, either Christmas night or the day after Christmas. President Reagan died in June, and both times Congress was not in session. You might wonder why that's an issue, because at the state funeral in D.C., every member of Congress and their spouse is invited. Every governor is invited and their spouse. The entire diplomatic corps was invited. With President Reagan, they had so many empty seats for this funeral, because, both Presidents Ford and Reagan, because they got so many RSVP no's. And and Congress doesn't turn in their RSVP list until 5 o'clock the night before the funeral. So for Reagan and Ford, they literally bust in Boy Scouts to fill the seats, which is just really sad. So this was great advice. I was ready for this. But here's the problem. The day before this funeral, I had 275 people I could not seat. I was desperately waiting for Congress to turn in their RSVPs. I way over invited because I knew I probably could. So finally, Congress turned in their RSVPs, and they handed me about 300 empty seats, maybe 400. So I could invite, so all 275 people who I was fine. But my backup plan, President Bush and I had talked about it. As I mentioned before, he was head of the CIA for a couple years under President Ford. And he said, if we have empty seats because of Congress and whoever, he said, I want to give them to CIA agents. So I had called the CIA before he died to let them know that this might happen, that I might call them at 5 o'clock the day before the funeral with 10 seats, with 50 seats, with whatever. Well, I had 100 seats, and they were over the moon. They said, oh, we'll fill them. And I said, you do know, I mean, the security was unbelievable. The current president is there, President Trump. This was his first term, of course, all the former presidents. Prince Charles was there, the the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was there. It was heavily attended by a lot of head of states because he just was so beloved. So the security was unbelievable. So I told my CIA contact, I says, I will need everybody's name, phone, and social security number. And he said, no, you don't. I said, yeah, I do. And he said, trust me, we'll get in the church. And that was it. And I knew exactly where they were going to sit because I had seated the church. They were all there. And to this day, I have no idea. But he just said, yeah, no, you don't need. No one needs to know who we are. I said, how are you going to get in? Not your problem. Is that just not the best story? I mean, but they were there. I looked. And if there was 100 empty seats, I was going to kill them. But they were there. But a funeral is an interesting, I called President Carter's chief of staff the day after he died. And I said, is there anything we can do to help? And she said, thanks to you and President Reagan and because I had sent them all the memos I had. She said, we got this. And she said, I'll be writing my own memo. Yeah.
Gene, character matters.
Yeah, it does.
And I mean, George H.W. Bush, he exemplified character. Tell me why that was so important to him.
You can tell I'm going to read something to you. He is just who he was. He was one of the most honest, humble people I knew. One of the things I loved about him is he never knew he was the biggest name in the room. I mean, we would go like to a baseball game or something, or a number of places. He'd say, "Hey, look over there, it's Roger Clemens. Oh my God, Roger Clemens!" And of course, he's a big pitcher. If you're not a baseball fan, great major league pitcher. And of course, everyone in the room was looking at him. And I would love to read to you. No one captured his essence of who he is, who he was, more than John Meacham, historian, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He did write the defining biography of President Bush called Destiny and Power, and he was one of his eulogists at the funeral. So I would just love to read a couple, because I think we're supposed to take questions. Oh dear, okay, I'll do this fast. As I mentioned, President Bush was shot down during World War II. And it really did drive his whole life. He once told me that he thought about his 2 crew members every single day. And you know what survivor's guilt is. President Bush absolutely had survivor's guilt. So you're just part of John's eulogy. Through the decades, President Bush would ask himself, why me? Why was I spared? In a sense, the rest of his life was a perennial effort to prove himself worthy of his salvation on that distant morning in the South Pacific. To him, his life was no longer wholly his own. There were always more missions to undertake, more lives to touch, more love to give. And what a headlong race he made of it all. He never slowed down. On the primary campaign trail, he once shook the hand of a department store mannequin in New Hampshire seeking votes. When he realized his mistake, he said, "Never know, always got to ask." You can hear his voice, can't you? As Dana Carvey said, the key to a Bush 41 impression was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. George Herbert Walker Bush was America's last great soldier statesman, a 20th century founding father. He governed with virtues that most closely resembled those of Washington and of Adams, of TR and FDR, of Truman and of Eisenhower, of men who believed in causes larger than themselves. And because life gave him much, he gave back. He stood in the breach in the Cold War against totalitarianism. He stood in the breach in Washington against unthinking partisanship. He stood in the breach against tyranny and discrimination. And on his watch, a wall fell in Berlin, a dictator's aggression did not stand, and doors across America opened to those with disabilities. I'll just read you one last thing. It was and is the most American of creeds. Abraham Lincoln's Better Angels of Our Nature, and George H.W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light. They are companion verses in America's national hymn, for Lincoln and Bush both called on us to choose the right over the convenient, to hope rather than to fear, to heed not our worst impulses, but our best instincts. That was him. That was him.
And that's why character mattered to George H.W. Bush. So we'll take a few questions from the audience. So anybody have a question for Gene?
Just a quick question. I was just curious. After he left the presidency, was he surprised when his son was elected president? Did he have a feeling early on that his son would one day reach the White House, or was he surprised at that?
He was, yeah, the answer is yes and no. The interesting thing is the son he thought would become president was Jeb. Because Jeb actually had an interest in politics before George W. did. When George W. decided to run for Texas and for governor in Texas, he ran against an incumbent, a Democratic incumbent named Ann Richards. And his mother told him he was crazy, that he would never beat her. But President Bush, as he watched his son be governor of Texas, I think he knew that he could and should be president of the United States. But Jeb was sort of the one that everybody thought would become president. And Jeb lost his first campaign to be governor of Florida. And then he was elected 4 years later in 1998. So, any other questions? I know a lot of you have to leave to go to another event. We have a question back here.
I was just going to make a comment. I lived in Houston when he was finished with the presidency, lived in the Galleria, and you used to see George and Barbara. They'd be in the Rice Epicurean. They were kind of part of the community. But speak just briefly, because he did amazing things in Houston when they had Rita. He worked with Gallery Furniture. Jim, forgot his name right now. They were buddies in amazing charity. Talk a little bit about how, kind of under the radar, what he did in Houston for the city, for the people, after his presidency, just as being a good citizen and a good community leader.
Thank you. It's such a great question. They were the number one citizens of Houston. we figured out that they probably spoke to every nonprofit group in Houston doing their annual fundraiser. And I was Mrs. Bush's speechwriter, and Jim McGrath was a guy named Jim McGrath was his speechwriter. And we told the Bushes, we're out of jokes. All 7 million people in Houston have heard your speech. But they went to they're huge Astro fans, they were huge Texan fans. They were everywhere, and they went grocery shopping. And I remember one time I went to a grocery store with them. It was such a bizarre experience. And I had said, let me stand and I'll buy. They didn't buy that much. They went in for cheese and crackers, and Mrs. Bush bought 2 sweet potatoes. It was very odd. And I said, let me get it, because everybody is staring at them. I mean, people are just stunned. There's George and Barbara Bush. But they just like being part of the community. And he dearly loved Houston, and they dearly loved him. And I do a lot of speaking and events in Houston. And of the 7 million people who live there, I swear 999,000 people met them, because they all tell me their stories. But President Bush, they did not think when he went to Kennebunkport in the summer of 2018, they did not think he would survive the flight home. And the doctors were strongly advising me and his medical aide that we needed to stay in Maine and let him pass there, because they said he will not survive that 4-hour flight home. So Evan and I were just having a conversation with him, and I guess I was going on and on. I said, wouldn't it be fun to stay here? Why don't we stay for Thanksgiving? We always went home in September. Let's wait until the leaves turn, and let's just stay here. And he looked at me. This was about 2 months before he died, and he said, are you asking me where I want to die? He just cut right through it. And I said, yes, I am. And he said, take me home. He wanted to go home to Houston. And he lived about another 6 weeks. So the trip home did not kill him. So.
How hard was it for you to have a personal life?
Well, I'm not married, which probably helped. I'll be honest, there were times, it was not unusual for me to work 80-hour weeks, because he always had ideas. But I so believed in what he was doing. So I did. I have a great, wonderful family that's very supportive, but I didn't, he pretty well was my life for 25 years, I would say. But it wasn't a bad life. As I tell people, Mikhail Gorbachev once told me to shut up. I'm oddly proud of that. And Tom Selleck kissed me right here. Yeah, I know you don't know who Tom Selleck is. It would be like if Ryan Gosling kissed me. He's still unimpressed. Okay. What? Mikhail Gorbachev told me to shut up. It was President Bush's 80th birthday, and he is letting us use the occasion to raise money. We raised a ton of money. I think we raised like $156 million for MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. He was chairman of the board, for Points of Light, and for the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. We were going to have his birthday party in a hotel ballroom. We had to move it to where the Astros play baseball. We moved it to Minute Maid Park because we got 20,000 RSVPs. We were stunned. Wow. We just sent out, and a bunch of his head of state friends came, including Mikhail Gorbachev. It's about 15 minutes to showtime, and Mikhail Gorbachev had brought President Bush a bottle of vodka for his president, and they're sitting in the Astros locker room drinking vodka shots. And the producer of the show called me and said, yeah, everybody who's not named George Bush, the President of the United States was there, that would be W. He said, anyone who's not named George Bush or married to George Bush has got to get out of that locker room and come take their seats. We're ready to start the show. So I bravely went to the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. And I said, Mr. President, could you please tell your father to quit drinking vodka shots with Mikhail Gorbachev? To which he said, that would be your job, not mine. That's not my job. Again, this is the man who couldn't get his dad to get in the car in Vatican Square. But I So I went over to, and I said to President Bush, I said, sir, it's about time for the show to begin. So we need everyone to take their seats, including, President Gorbachev. So President Gorbachev's, I saw President Gorbachev ask his interpreter what I said. And I could tell it irritated him because his answer back to his interpreter was, and so I said to Pavel, what did he just say? And poor Pavel started hem and hawed and said, he just asked me to tell you to shut up. I'm very proud of it. What the heck? I think we need to quit. So if you'd like to buy a copy of Character Matters, we are selling them out there. And if you think you might want to get a copy of The Man I Knew, we don't have any copies, but I have book plates I can sign. You can order a copy. So I hope I'll see some of you out there. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.
Gene, thank you for coming to Marshfield and being a part of the Cherry Blossom Festival. We're so grateful.
I don't know how to turn this off, so this is a hot mic. We got to be